Prevention Month. My name is Clay Merrill. I'm the Director of Advancement with the Child Abuse Prevention Center, and this is a collaboration that we are participating with the California Office of Child Abuse Prevention. We're excited to be doing this. We have a wonderful speaker here today who is addressing a topic that could not be more timely in the wake of what we have seen in the last 24 hours. So I'd like to turn the time now over to the Chief of the Office of Child Abuse Prevention, Angela Ponovas.
Thank you, Clay, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Child Abuse Prevention Month webinar series. We are happy to see all of you. I believe that the previous presentations we've shared in the webinar series by Amelia Frank Meyer and Kevin Campbell were provoking. They challenged us to not do business as we have always done business, but to truly understand the power of connection and reimagine how we can best serve children and families. Today's presentation will add another important layer to our ability to reimagine. It's a timely presentation falling on the heels of the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And I believe I read on LinkedIn this morning that the CDC is announcing racism as a public health crisis threatening health and safety. But before we get started, I want to provide some logistics for the success of today's webinar. Please mute your mics. Use the raise hand function for questions that you may have, and use the chat box for comments. Just know that we will try to address all questions at the end of today's presentation. So as we get started, I want to first thank the Child Abuse Prevention Center for joining the Office of Child Abuse Prevention and co-hosting this webinar series. The CAP Center has a great team and they do amazing work. And it's an honor to have them with us today and assisting in the presentation that we're about to enjoy. So thank you to the CAP Center. In the last two webinars, Kevin Campbell stated, we are moving into a meaningful and actionable conversation about prevention. And Amelia Frank Meyer said, do what love would do. And she challenged us to know better, do better, and be better. Quite a few years ago, I was in the Oakland area, and an elderly Black man came up to me and said, people like you have jobs and make money off of the backs of people like me. I was young and naive and very unaware. I was disturbed by his comment. And I thought, doesn't he know that I'm a social worker? I try to help people. Of course, I have realized so much more since then. And I think that that's what these webinars are driving home. Years ago, we knew one thing, but today we know something different. These webinars are intended to help us in raising our awareness of our personal frame of reference that influences our work. Today, we are privileged to have Corey Best as our presenter. Corey will share effective ways to embrace the reality of race, racism, through belonging. I had the opportunity to talk to Corey a few weeks ago, and it was clear to me that he is articulate, engaging, non-shaming, and brings great wisdom to any conversation. Corey is a dedicated father and the founder of Mining for Gold. He is originally from Washington, D.C. and now resides in Florida. This is where Corey began his transformation into adaptive leadership training, systems building, authentic family engagement, race equity, promoting protective factors, social equality, and highlighting good enough parenting for those impacted by the child welfare system. Corey has utilized his platform as a community curator to rebuild child and family serving systems that are responsive to sharing power among constituents with a laser focus on preventing and dismantling all forms of racism. I am honored to introduce to you today Corey Best.
Well, thank you, Angela, for that warm introduction and welcome. I won't go into a whole diatribe about who I am, since we are, going to ask everybody to lean into discomfort and embrace paradox and speak truth. And this is recorded. I think my dear friend and colleague Amelia will appreciate this. I'm wondering if she was also introduced as being articulate. So these nuances that we have in our world, right? This othering of people starts with our language and how we view people and how we fear people. I think our world today is much different than it was yesterday, right? In just 24 hours. And I had a few plans after Angela and I talked about this morning with the team and you beautiful people, and all of that went to the wayside. Not all, right? I just kind of tweaked it a little bit for today. Not improv, but really wanted to model and lean into what might be, right, a shared experience that we're all having right now. And that shared experience, I'd ask if we can embrace that as a way of us being connected, right? The world is a messy place, and it's through these experiences that we see truly, if we utilize tough interpretations, as John Powell would say, there's really no other, right? There's really no other at the deepest spiritual level, but our minds tells us differently. And how we're usually structured is through institutions and structures, right? So before I go too deep into a conversation, and I hope to elicit some feedback, some thoughts, some ahas, your reflection, please utilize the chat. And now I'm curious if we can attend just for a few moments to any tensions that anyone may be holding, any thoughts. Are we relieved? Are we disappointed? Are we surprised at where we are in our country? Or what have we learned about ourselves in just under a year since we saw this form of righteousness and othering occur in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota? So I'm just curious if any one or two would like to just come off and really deposit some thinking into this space before we kick off, or utilize the chat.
To say that I was very moved yesterday. We had a meeting in our organization, and a lot of people spoke out, and it was very nice to hear even some of our leaders speak on this subject. It is hard for me as a person of color and a multiracial background to have that joy, and then to also hear at the same time that I work in the foster care system, and a young foster care woman who was 16 years old had her life taken yesterday at the same time as the verdict for George Floyd. So I have to say, I do feel like we've come a long way as a country. I feel that there's hope for my little ones and the little ones that I service every day. But that being said, to see that, the issues I equate what happened yesterday as a moment of accountability and not a moment of justice. And I know some people use that word justice, but I think justice is a reform of the system and not necessarily one man being put in prison for his actions. So that's just my take on it.
Well stated. I appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else?
I can speak a little bit. I identify as Punjabi American, and I think a lot of the things that have been going on are so integrated, and it just shows how important our work is right now and educating and working on changing things systematically. I just, we have all of our individual things going on, and then we have everything else going on in the world, and I think I'm still processing a lot, as many may be.
And I appreciate that. I think we're all in the stage of processing, and we are in the right space. Question though, for some reason, are you seeing my slideshow in full screen mode right now?
It's not in full screen yet.
Okay, if I could get someone, maybe a co-host to monitor the waiting room. I think as I have to click admit, that's causing a little bit of disruption in my ability to get full screen. So that would be greatly appreciated. Just that little tech support would help me out a lot. There we go. So it's such an important conversation, and my slideshow will not get into full mode. So let's proceed. I'm not sure what's exactly happening right now. Let me try one more time before we kick off. So I appreciate each of you sharing your heart, and as Cornel West says, despair can no longer get the last words. I do believe that there is some hope in our future. And with that being said, I guess I have to really just proceed, because I don't want to bog up the time trying to get the PowerPoint to get into full slide mode. So what I can say is that through the teaching of John Powell, again, about connection and belonging, that there are some central themes that affects us all in this condition. This condition is also the American condition. And those two themes, primary themes, are who belongs and who doesn't belong, or who's othered, right? And so when we look at that, we begin to see that there are things and ways and practices that we uphold that marginalize individuals. And this could be based on identity, ability, language, skin tone, race, heritage, culture, right? Then there's status. So think about how we sort of describe individuals who are poor. Think about the practices that we promote, the programs, the goods, the services. And what I'm learning more and more about othering and belonging is that when we other individuals, there's a level of fear that comes with that. And then there's also a level of fear what we might be or what we might lose as a result of not being considered a part of the in group, right? Now, a traveling question I'd like to just have you think about. Where do you belong, right? And who told you you belong there? And which structures, institutions, practices, and occurrences positioned you in that place of belonging, right? So those are just three questions I would like for you to just travel with as we think about. I'm going to try to replay the slideshow here because I think it's really timely. So as we think about where we are as a country, we are in America. So I hope you don't mind that I'll just run it from right here where we are and sort of do it like that, right? That works for me. So we are in America, right? And when you look at America, think about that SAT that we took. There's an anagram there. Do we think about America being I am race? Do we ever really think about that? So what does America mean, right? America formed its identity in 1776. And through that formation of their identity, right? There were certain things that were written for quote unquote all people. Now, as we grow in our evolution and understanding of the world and who we are connected to and who we fear and what myths and narratives we carry about people, we see that the Declaration was not necessarily written for women, Indigenous individuals, Black and Brown people. Typically, right, if we look at structures, interconnected nature, and how we began to really other people, and othering began way back when, but I'll just start with these United States, right? We can go back to 1492, we can go to the 13th century, we can go way back in history and really understand that we began to other people based on status, physical attributes. And even we know now that slavery has predated race. But when we look at these United States of America, we have a peculiar relationship with people who do not fit standardized white normative ways of being. And so the Declaration of Independence gave us information that said all men did not necessarily mean all men and all women. Right? So we move into this arrangement that we have, and we think about the notion and the themes that I mentioned before, that we're all sort of impacted by the conditions of belonging and othering in one way or another, and that we're connected. Think about the internet, right? Most of us are only connected through institutions and structures. So how might we begin to think about the right relationship? Because if our relationships currently are contingent upon our interconnectedness to an institution, then are they authentic relationships or quasi-authentic relationships? And so our history sets us up in a way where we begin to see that structures in and of themselves are not neutral. Institutions are not neutral, such as we believe in race-neutral policies will get us to universal impact. Well, we can look back at the Americans with Disabilities Act and think about it differently. That was a targeted approach that actually impacted all able-bodied people, right? So that piece of legislation has impacted us able-bodied people. Think about living in a text world right now. We're in the smartphones, we're walking down an urban street, and boom, you're about to cross a light, and all of a sudden you hear the traffic signal say, stop. It helps us to navigate the streets. 2-year-old son in a stroller. I shot basketball, I have a sore knee. I don't want to take the stairs, I take the ramp. It's benefiting me as well. So again, when we look at history, we should be able to understand that history creates our culture and our culture shapes our identity. Now, when we think of culture, decontextualized culture looks like identity. And what we haven't done enough of in our practices in our world is to contextualize othering explicitly race and racism and how that is one manifestation of othering. So we have some internal mechanisms that we really focus a lot on, right? We do a lot of bias reduction. We are now hearing more white people or advantaged individuals talk about their privilege. And we hear in Black circles or Black and Brown circles how we have begun to internalize white superiority in various ways that continue to disconnect us and cut us off from people. And as we continue to disconnect and cut ourselves off from people, we are actually cutting ourselves off from humanizing ourselves with people. And we've heard the concept of dehumanization. However, Martin Luther King tells us that love without power is sentimental. Power without love is tyranny. And so what drives our systems of inequities is power and economics. And that comes up and shows up in our interpersonal lives, our institutions, and our structure. When you think of what racism means, many of us, if it's 106 people right now on this call, we may have 85 different definitions of what racism is. And so it tells me that through othering, through not having a sense of belonging, that we're not even talking from the same page. So racism in and of itself is a system. If you can take 4 seconds and think about what a system means by definition, you build upon that, and then think about the word design. So we're in a state where systems improvement and transformation are asking us to reimagine and redesign new ways of being, right? Well, through that reimagining, through that redesign, have we interrogated the current design enough to uproot ways of belonging or why we have intentionally othered individual? The third bracket or concept I want you to think about when you're sort of immersed in a new way of thinking about racism is advantage, right? So we have a system by design that advantages one group while disadvantaging all other groups of individuals, right? And then that fourth component that gives us a little more clarity is social and institutional power. So if you build on those 4 concepts, you have emerged at what racism is and also the impact of. So I'm talking less about individual hate, discrimination, biases. Right now, today, we can take all of the world's, all hate-filled, discriminatory individuals and place them elsewhere. We'll still see racial disparate outcomes in our communities. So it tells us that 3 observations are necessary for us to deepen our conversation when it comes to how we might have effective race talk and also begin to do things differently. The first observation is that racism, racial disparities looks the same across all systems. From early education to sports and entertainment, we see a white advantage gap. In every single system, remember, racism as a system, therefore we must look at the data. The data is the impact of power oppressive systems. So when we look at data, we see that across all sectors and in all institutions, we have a bookend, which is a white advantage gap. So the next step to be able to think about belonging is to ask ourselves, why are we structured in such a way that our systems continually advantage white families? See, I pose the question that way because I want us to move away from thinking that Black is the deficit. So we're always looking at the impact on Black kids, the impact on Black families. And our system does have a huge negative impact on Black families. That is a reality. But the more that we can look at it from a deficit-based perspective, the more that we fear Black people, the more that we say Black is the deficit. George Floyd was not killed because he was Black. See, there's nothing wrong with anybody's skin color, right? George Floyd was killed because of some man's righteousness, who was his behaviors were tolerated by a structure. It wasn't George Floyd's Blackness. See, we are living in othering, and that othering takes us to anti-Blackness. So therefore, the way we even message what happens to young boys and girls and women and men today that are of color, we say that their skin color is the fault of someone else's actions. I beg to differ. I think that in order for us to really belong, we must grapple with some of the messiness that it's not the Black issue or the skin, it's our mindsets. And our mindsets comes from a place that has given us an opportunity to think about things in ways and feel and absorb invisible messages that continues to create division within our country, our systems. So through talk, tales, stories, gossip, anecdotes, pronouncements, news accounts, oration, sermons, preachments, and the like, definitions are presented and feelings are expressed. If the interaction becomes increasingly circular and reinforcing, devoid of serious inner opposition, that's your first effective step. So we want a toolkit out of this. Your first effective step is to interrogate self. Resist the urge to buy into the false narrative of inferiority. First key point, such currents grow, fuse, and become strengthened. It is through such a process that a collective image of subordinate group is formed and a sense of group position is set. Back to the question of who do you belong to? Where do you belong? How did you get there? Who told you you were there, right? Who gave you that? There was a power source that gave you that. And we're going to unpack all of what that means in just a moment. And I'll just talk more about this first racial arrangement. So many of us know the history. Some of us are growing in our education. I don't consider myself expert, but I do consider myself an expert in learning it and always attempting to connect historical occurrences to see why our contemporary racial inequities continue to churn in the way that they do. A system one is set and designed to do whatever it is to do invisibly. Right there, there's very little that's stopping that system. And today we feel that just like the body when it's sick, the system needs balance, right? So there's going to be a lot of pushback on justice advocates, on activism, on confronting and naming race and racism in order to get to justice. We will see political pushback. That is a part of building our fitness, fortitude, and stamina to do the work that is just, pure, and creates environments where individuals feel a sense of belonging in community. So Carlos Linnaeus was not the first pseudoscientist to think about classifying individuals. Francois Brenet in 1684, he began to look at things from brain skull size, right? Utilizing, again, pseudoscience to really say that individuals with these particular characteristics were indeed inferior. Carlos Linnaeus, Johann Blumenbach, whom I'll talk about in just a moment, and another very young scholar of the day, all Europeans, Bloom. All three of them came up to the same point, that Europeans were on top. It's amazing. They weren't related. They didn't live in the same neighborhood, same hood, but they all came up to one consensus that Europeans were on top. Now, this is where we begin to see, one, that race is a myth. It's a social construct, of course, but it's also socially important, right? It's really important because it is how we see the world. And through these centuries-old narratives, we continue to create division, cut ourselves off from individuals who do not look like us, who do not play like us, who do not worship like us, who do not have the same habits as us. And our structures have positioned us, at least in community, to stick with our affinity groups, right? Socioeconomic, poverty, right? Urban, right? Rural. Look at those setups, right? People did not create those setups. Systems created those setups, right? Now, going back to the original arrangement, we can see that Carl Linnaeus began to specify and categorize everything from flora to fauna. And when you look at plant and animal life, there's always a hierarchy, right? There's always a hierarchy. He did the same thing with human beings. Well, in this case, his brilliant idea really morphed into something that became very barbaric in these United States that we are continuing to grapple with today. So you can see from the slide that Europeanists, sanguine, pale, muscular, swift, clever, inventive, right? Governed by laws. Asians, melancholic, yellow, inflexible, severe, dark-eyed, governed by opinions. One thing that's notable about all three of these pseudoscientists is that they did acknowledge that Native Americans are Americans, right? But Americanus, caloric, copper-colored, straightforward, eager, combative, right, governed by customs. Let's look at Indian child welfare and how we were on orphan trains, and the mantra was to kill the Indian and save the man. So wherever there's othering, there's also a thread of assimilation, right? Because the more I become like the power, the more safe, the more free, the more belonging I feel, because I am now told by structures that that is the standard. We've set the standard of the day, of the centuries, to be Europeans on top. And then we have this bracket here where Carlos Linnaeus really didn't know what these people were and how to classify them. So he decided to call them dwarfs and the Patagonian giant, agile and faint-hearted. Now, when we get to Africanus, we see that phlegmatic, black, slow, relaxed, negligent, right? So it's important for us to understand why this happened this way. Because what we were doing, we're building a system to justify slavery, right? So slavery predates race. Individuals were already enslaved when Carlos Linnaeus began this pseudoscientific work. And then to justify slavery, we knew that that stolid individuals were dependable. That's how he classified Black people: dependable, unemotional, with no animation. And this transpired and morphed, right? So again, thinking back to our previous speakers and reimagining doing something new and bold, we have to undo what it is we're currently living in, or at least embrace it, right? We have to know exactly what it is that's creating some of this difference. So Johann Blumenbach morphed in ideas. And as you begin to think about the classifications here, please note that we don't use the term Caucasian any longer because it's pseudoscientific. Many white people on this call cannot trace their heritage, their lineage back to the Caucasus Mountains, right? But Johann Blumenbach believed that all white people of the day were from the Caucasus Mountains. All yellow people, Mongolia, classified as Mongoloid. All brown people, red and brown people, indigenous or Australian, so he called them Australoids, red and brown. Now, Africa is quite interesting because we see that this system sort of breaks down. Africa being the continent, and then there was a thought that we would consider Black or Negroid to be Ethiopoids, but Ethiopia resisted white imperialism. So Ethiopia was not colonized by whiteness, so they broke with the power structure. So why is this important? This is important because it gives us an opportunity to see one of the most impactful forms of othering people that we still vibe and live on today. Now, so the conclusion of what I mentioned about Blumenbach is that the brutal, troubled history of this idea of race really demonstrates the power and ideologies of human difference. Right? So that's why this is powerful. This is illustrating how we live in a world that othering becomes the practice, not belonging. Human difference, again, back to spirituality piece, at the core, there is no human difference. Right? There was once upon a time, Black people weren't even considered a species, right? And by law, Supreme Court also, this is how the social construct becomes legal. Supreme Court also justified Black people as being 3/5 human. So let's look at race and let's look at racism. Again, I've given you those 4 brackets to begin to understand it differently as a system. But when you think of race, this goes above and beyond just being a social construct. It tells us that it's a specious classification. And what does that mean? It means it's not founded. It means it's a myth. It's not real. Specious is bogus, but we have made it real. So created during a period of worldwide colonial expansion by Europeans that became known as white, using them as a model for humanity for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and advantage. When we think about racism, I want you to begin to think about racism as defined as social institutional power combined with race prejudice. So it's a formula there, right? It's a formula. It is a system of advantage that for those that are considered white and of oppression for those that are not considered white. It is a white supremacy system supported by an all-class collaboration called white to maintain hierarchical status. That comes from my dear colleagues at the Race Equity Institute and the People's Institute. So I know that the word or the term white supremacy or whiteness may cause some reactions. That uncomfortability is necessary in this conversation. Again, we can take all white supremacists and put them somewhere else, and we still see othering and racial disparities. This is not about blame or guilt or shame here. A white supremacy system emerged through the Declaration of Independence. And through that Declaration of Independence, we began to see that all men, the Declaration says all men are created equal. However, individuals that are brown, Black are seemingly and somehow being treated less than human. And the standards for being human were always defined and measured by European standards. And it's critically important for us to note that Asian Pacific Islanders in the 19th century, their racial identity changed 4 times. So if we're not talking about a man-made invention here, I don't know what we are, right? Because they were half the century were considered white, and then the other half, they were considered Pacific Islander and Asian American. When you look at Latina, some used to say Chicana, Hispanic, what have you. It's baffling to me that there is no racial category for Hispanic. Hispanics are, by government, forced to put themselves in a non-white or white box, right? It's no just Hispanics have their own race, even though 250,000 South Americans were here, and America took most of what we now know as Mexico, 10 states, and I wonder if we ever question why didn't America take it all? Some theorize because we didn't want a brown West Coast, but that's just the theory, who knows? But there's some things that I want you to begin to provoke yourselves to think more about. Another way of explaining this racial arrangement that we have is to play a simple game of Monopoly, right? And so imagine this as contemporary, our contemporary communities, our practices, the outcomes we see in 2021. So the first hour of Monopoly, let's imagine that we flip the script on the original arrangement. That the first hour of Monopoly, indigenous individuals cultivated the land, kept their land, that there was no theft of native land and othering happening. However, through that first hour, Native Americans and indigenous peoples were able to set and structure laws that govern the rest of the game. And now imagine the second hour of Monopoly, where Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Latina, Hispanic Americans, Latinx, and Black people were able to play in that second hour of Monopoly. And through that second hour of Monopoly, what's happening is that those brown people did not just appear in the world, they were witness and privy to seeing that the Native Americans were actually structuring the laws, the rules, Christianity, whatever faith they believed in, became the rule of law of the day through that first hour. It was that, if we flip the script, Native Americans utilized the 4 as the bracket to say we need more bodies, commerce, to cultivate and create and build this beautiful Monopoly game. Now, in the third hour of that Monopoly game, let's imagine, if we flip the script, that white people were allowed to play. Now, I'm putting emphasis on the word allowed, right? So who gets to say so, right? Who gets to say you belong somewhere? Who gets to tell you you have access? Who gets to structure things? Now, in that third hour of Monopoly, I'm curious if the chat can start buzzing now. What's left? All of us, I'm sure, have played Monopoly, right? What's left if you start playing Monopoly in the third hour of the game? Very little. And so how does that show up then? It shows up in our framing. So as we begin to continue to other individuals, let's imagine right now that you are all sort of filmmakers, right? You're a YouTube blogger, or you're taking a snapshot for your social media page, whatever the case may be. As a filmmaker with an ideology of othering, right, based on a system of advantages to advantage whiteness while disadvantaging others. And also you come with a worldview that maybe your race is superior. And again, you're cut off from all that's going on outside of what we see on the surface. So look inside the snapshot. As a filmmaker, we leave out certain things of the picture. We don't want people to see, like, we're using backgrounds today. We don't want people to see certain things in our homes, right? We crop pictures because we don't want people to see everything else. We have the power to tell the story or to share the image in the way that we want, but it's based on our worldview of people and ourselves. Let's unpack what I mean. There's an invention of racial ideology that is formed in historic values, antiquated beliefs, assumptions, norms, and quote unquote, the others, right? So that ideology, if you are a filmmaker, and let's say you're a filmmaker social worker, you're a filmmaker prevention specialist, if you're a filmmaker home visitor, you're coming to that relationship with a preset or a preconceived notion of what that individual is, thinks, how they behave, based on what the world has given us. Said another way, there are certain things that's critically important for us to remember if we think about it. Many of us on this call have never said a derogatory word, have never used a negative racial epithet, and we marry outside of our race. Some of us have mixed race children, biracial friends, connection. We break bread together, we travel together, and we might even ride in a car with a coworker that doesn't share my race for 3 to 6 hours, right? So it shows us that we can be together on surface. The reason why I ask you to think about this is that there are certain things that have come from our past that are, what some say, are serviceable to the memory. Serviceable to the memory. So even though we may not have spoke a thing, even though we may not believe a thing, we adhere to what's in the environment. These messages about others are in our environment, and again, we adhere to it. So our racial ideology comes to play in just about everything that we do, even intra-racially with one another. And that creates messages that we share with the world, especially in service practice, right? So again, you're the filmmaker, you have an ideology, you've taken a shot, or you've written a report about a person or family, and then there's a message that comes with that based on your ideology. And your ideology gives you an opportunity and the power to describe how an individual is, if that individual is deemed worthy or deserving of something. And your message needs an audience. And this is how we continue to churn the system of inequities. So our ideology creates the message. Our message needs an audience. Our message needs to attach to someone, because we'll get to distribution in just a moment. But in our work, our audience is the public, right? We know that we are in a business that requires us to get funding from sources, funding from the feds, funding if we're nonprofit, from fundraising. And if we're selling a message about families being broken and need saving, then the public attaches themselves to that narrative that these kinds of families, those people are in need of help. And I come with my charitable and benevolent heart to donate to ensure that we are saving and rescuing people. Law enforcement is another audience, preventive service providers, and also CPS. Then we need some way to distribute, right? We need a way to distribute this message, because that comes up in the things that we do not talk about in recruitment, in training, in schools, how we sort of describe and discuss ACEs today, telling the single story, the narratives and the myths about people. In this case, we see the outcomes. We're talking about how our narratives fit a pre-described notion of what good is, of what worthy is, and of what whiteness is. And compared to those narratives, the system that we've constructed, there's really very little win in that space for non-white individuals. And there's power. And so we have an ideology that begins to create this film, this message. That message reaches an audience. That audience becomes part of the distribution source, and everything is now driven by power and resources. Those resources are often white dominant led. So think about where leaders are in your institution. Think about where our political structures are, who's leading those. Think about who you're voting for. All of those things come to play because we are interconnected. Again, we don't have to speak a thing any longer. We don't have to say a negative word. We don't have to use N-words anymore, right? The system has been designed and set up to do exactly what it's doing today, but it takes us to sort of break away from that system and push back a little bit. So to put all of this in a better context for you, I want us to really understand that since 1607 Jamestown, 1619, some of us go back, but we're at about 402 years and maybe 25 weeks of a system of inequities, right? If we just start with the identity here in these United States of America. So to put this in context, I want you to think about when Black children became a part of the conversation, especially when it comes to prevention and child welfare. It wasn't until the 60s that Black children became a part of the conversation or invited into the conversation, because we see that for 256 years, Black families lived in chattel slavery, legalized chattel slavery, and another 100 years in Reconstruction and Jim Crow. That takes us up to 1964, where we were able to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. From the passage of that act to present, we are only 56 years away from 1964. So what that tells us, for those of us who really like the numbers and the data, we were in Jim Crow and Reconstruction for 100 years. We are now in quote unquote freedom, with access, with opportunity, with entry points. and we're still seeing disparate outcomes and an overwhelming, alarming rate of violence at the hands of others and also police officers. So we are only 13% of our histories, right? 13% of our history in these United States have been spent post civil rights, 56 years. So in order to create a sense of belonging, again, belonging is not always about having the answers, being nice, kumbaya. It's understanding ways of bringing the unconscious to the conscious. And when I say conscious, I'm not talking about our smarts, our wits, our professionalism. I'm talking about a conscious mind that requires us to examine, interpret, and to also ask very hard questions of ourselves about what it is I am saying yes to, what it is I am asking myself to understand, to think, and to believe differently, and what it is I must do to get in right relationship that does not create a sense of othering for anybody. So this message here reminds me of the peculiar system of slavery. It is the peculiar system of slavery, but it also reminds me of our CPS system in modern day times. So again, Black children were not considered a part of the conversation until the 60s. If we look at the timeline, if we go back and look at that timeline, the White House had its first conversation in 1909 of the care and dependent children. And then the Children's Bureau was formed in 1912. And after 1912, we saw Social Security Act, Brown v. Board of Education in 54, which, by the way, schools should have never been segregated, because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment has always told us that any vestiges of the institution of slavery were abolished by the Supreme Court. But the nuance here is how we're structured institutionally to one another. So states had the opportunity and the power to discriminate against Black and brown children and kept school segregation well and live into the 50s. And when we look at CPS, we see that in 62, through the work of Dr. Kemp, right, he began to talk about battered child syndrome and things of that nature. And from 62 to 74, we saw CAPTA, right? So CAPTA started this whole process of allowing CPS agencies to use child abuse prevention dollars to begin to structure ways of surveilling families. Now, if we take that history lesson and we put that and attach it to othering, right? If we have fear about Black bodies, brown bodies, because they are the other, they are poor, they are gay, they are lesbian, they are disabled, they are the margins, power always tells us, again, to the quote of Dr. King, power without love is tyranny. So with that power, the power to over-surveil individuals, we have already categorized them as something that they're not. It feeds into our minds. It becomes serviceable to the memory in the grocery store. The lady who thinks she's doing the right thing because mom was really stern with her child thought that the best route to go was to call CPS. That mom just so happens to have had a hit before. She so happens to be Black. She may even smoke weed. Then she gets thrown into this daunting and overwhelming system where there's no signs of actual maltreatment. But some of us believe that the institution of slavery per se was and is as justifiable as the relationship of husband and wife, parent and child, or any other civil institution of the state, and is most necessary to the well-being of the Negro, being the only form of government or pupillage which can raise him from barbarism or make him useful to himself or others. And I have no doubt but that institution thus far in our country has resulted in the happiness and elevation of both races That is, the Negro and the white man in no period of the world's history have 3 million of the Negro race been so elevated in scale of being or so much civilized or Christianized as those in the United States as slaves. This last piece is what I really want you to hone into and connect this mindset and othering, this concept of othering to our current CPS and nonprofit systems. They are better clothed, better fed, better housed, and more cared for in sickness and in health than has ever fallen to the lot of any similar number of the Negro in any age or nation. And as a Christian people, I feel that it is the duty of the South to keep them in their present position at any cost and at every peril, even independently of the questions of interest and security. So we have a best interest clause in just about all of our legislation. So when we think about how slavery became increasingly entrenched in our structures, you take the narrative of Black people who were born into slavery due to classifying of race and justifying the treatment of non-white people. We began to see that the myth of who Black people were also justified the treatment. That myth that justifies the treatment justifies the policies that we write that govern structures and institutions. And it's no wonder why we have not examined our policies to the point where we say we may need to think about mandating things that are filled with humanity, right? And also that are quite possibly race explicit. So like all systems of oppression, inequality and inequity are by design, right? By design. Therefore, they can be redesigned. And what I want us to begin to grapple with as we move into the next phase of our conversation, I would like, if at all possible, to just create, some random breakout rooms and give you 15 minutes to have some conversation on your own, or Angela and Clay, is that too much of improv? I know you're recording right now. Do you not want me to do that?
No, that's okay, if that's what you'd like to do.
Okay. I want to give individuals a chance to have some conversation, some small conversation amongst themselves. So I'm going to break you out into groups of 6 to 7, 5 to 6 people. Take those questions if you'd like. I can drop them in the chat for you. If you give me a second, I'll do that. I'll drop those questions in the chat, and then we can have a conversation. I think getting us to a place of feeling a sense of belonging, I will break you out into some groups and get us to start talking, and then we'll come back and wrap it up a little bit. Here we go. All right, you're all set to go. Join a room, engage in those 3 conversations as much as you can, and then we'll come back, reflect, and then dive a little bit deeper into the wrap up.
Are you going to assign rooms or?
Yeah, there they are right there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
right. Do I have everybody back? Just thumbs up. I can't see everybody, or a yell, something just to let me know that we're back. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
All right, all right. I needed to feel something.
We
Thank
got you.
All right, all right. I belong, right? I said I belong, and I belong. So I appreciate that. Let's see if we can just take a moment and just get maybe three reflections of, your conversation. Aha, something concise that you discussed about imagination of a U.S. weird. And I saw a lot of chat conversation about checking a box and how that feels for us, and it kind of cuts against the grain, right? And it shows us that we're constantly in this environment that's requiring us to be something less than human, right? So we'll discuss a little bit more about why scholars feel it's important, though, that we have to see race because it's socially important, and if we utilize antiquated social norms of not seeing race, we live in colorblind society. That's not appropriate because it strips individuals away from their heritage, the names that their mamas gave them, the names that daddy gave them. It strips them of their uniqueness. What we want to do is to be able to not have to put blinders on to make just, pure, equitable, and humane decisions about a person's life. That's the place where we want to go, to be able to see everybody's humanness, not feel because of power that we have to tame it, that we have to say what's professional or not about it, what's appropriate about it, that we have to force individuals to shorten or use nicknames, right? We assimilate in so many ways based on our categorization and othering that we feel that we have to fit into spaces in order to be embraced, and that should not be so. We want to see color, we want to see race, we want to see identity, we want to see ethnicity, we want to see culture, right? And we still want to see all of the beauty and ugliness that goes along with humanity, and be in a position to make the right decision for children, for families, for our loved ones, for one another. I think when the masses of white people can see that there's a benefit in social justice for them, we may start to see movement. This isn't a conversation to ask those in power to accept us. This is a conversation to say that we accept ourselves in a world that has issues with othering and belonging, right? Not to feel that we have to be minimized because we're not in the quote unquote in crowd. And that's how many of us flow, even those of us that live in poverty, even those of us that have Black skin. We attach ourselves to things and places and people who are like us, right? So those that are in more critical need, have more critical needs than us, right? Those become the others. Those individuals who are superstars, famous, or got it going on, or what have you, in our circle of friends, those are the people that we attach ourselves to. But again, I just want to say that it is never okay to hate anybody. And it's always the right thing to do to love everybody. So I'm going to stop there before we get into another level of a sermon here, because I feel my grandfather coming into my soul right now. So I want to hear from you. Let's take about three individuals or groups to hear what you had. If I knew you personally, I would call names, but I don't. So we're going to have a brave soul just unmute and jump in here. I see Sarah raising her hand. Is that for me? Have I lost you?
There's a little bit in chat. I'll go. My name's Michael. Our group talked about how when we're young and naive, we can kind of feel like race doesn't matter until you kind of see the world a little more, and how our country kind of went through a phase of wanting to be naive when President Obama was president and saying we're living in a post-racial country, only to have the opposite proven to us, even while he was president, but especially after.
Now, is that, let me ask, because I don't know if I've asked this question before. I've heard the response before. Was that a harsh reality for you?
Yeah, it was a harsh reality that it could get that bad and go that far to the top. I think I've been in enough conversations and have enough people in my social circle to know that it wasn't a post-racial time under President Obama. I didn't have those illusions, but how bad it got was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I often wonder myself again, because I want us to all live in color consciousness, right? So I don't know if post-racial is where we want to be. I think we want to collectively and through solidarity dismantle systems of oppression and white supremacy, right? That impacts overwhelmingly non-white people, to get us to a place where some individuals, if not all, are able to define success for themselves, have access, sense of mastery, social connectedness, and are not judged based on an antiquated myth of superiority, right? So that would be the system of justice that I've described. And I don't know if we've seen justice in our 402 plus years of these United States. We have an aspiration of what it looks like. However, together, I do believe that the more we resist, the more we coalesce around ideas and principles that value humanness, we will get there. And this humanness, this concept of belonging, is not one that just stays in our brains, right? The conscious mind is the smallest part of the mind, and the unconscious mind is the biggest. So it's ever present. It's always consuming ideas, and usually it's picking from information that we haven't validated to be real, unfortunately, right? So I saw one other hand. Would you mind just jumping off mute? And
Sure. I just loved your language, so thank you for that, Corey. I really appreciated the thoughtfulness you did when you just did that. To answer your question, I was not surprised. And I think it also goes back to when you were talking about assimilation and othering. I think as white people, just like other folk, we tend to find like-minded white folk. So I moved to California. I live in California. Yeah, and I'm from Missouri, and I grew up about 15 minutes from Ferguson.
yeah.
So when my family goes back to my family of origin and we walk into Walmart and we see gun racks all over, or we hear language at the bar, or we, or my children, when we're in a place and they're like, Mom, this isn't comfortable for me, right? Because they've just been put in such a so I think for my children, even though we talk about things very openly, as you can imagine, it was harder for them because they had been raised by us, where we talked very openly about, the beauty of culture, and that all the stuff that, we'd learn, and we're around those families. But because I'm from the Midwest, and because I have different families of different, when this all came down, it's just like even the COVID stuff with the vaccine, there was a big party and it was in the Ozarks. I knew before I was like, oh, that's Missouri, right? So,
Right.
I go back and it's kind of like being 55 and all of a sudden looking in the mirror and going, holy crap, I really see myself. I'm 55, right? So you go back to Missouri and you're like, oh yeah, this is why I left.
Mm-hmm.
or, oh yeah, this isn't, but this is really the people. This is the organicness of the, and to them, this is their norm, right? This is the
Absolutely.
discussion. These words are okay. So that's where I was with it. It was very sad for me. And yet there's very much hope for me because at least finally we're seeing people are able to identify it, right? Where before it was just what you were raised in. I mean, I can think of language, just terrible language until I was in my late teens. I was like, oh my God, that's what that really means. Like, you know, but anyway, so that would be my answer. But I think it's harder for some groups because, and I think I'm just being humble, particularly white, because we tend to be like, oh, I only hang out with people that really are, it's a very mixed group of folk, right? They're very just, so when I get faced with a homogeneous place or all that kind of stuff, those are my othering kind of, right? I mean, when I'm with this other group of people. So anyway, or I go to Texas, same thing. We were in Texas.
I'm gonna lean in and say, you know, I love that, and I want to appreciate that, and then also honor the space, right? So so that some others, at least one other, can come in right after I attend to two things that I see in the chat. I just wanted to elevate how I, because of the analysis that someone and people have deposited into me, how I'm seeing these responses. The one is from Mary, right? When we are aware of who we are and to be proud of our heritage without efforts to shame us, we are powerful. I want to add to one, elevate, and then embrace and add a little of how I'm seeing that. So Mary, we're talking about structurally connected, right? Going back to these central things: who belongs, who is other, right? Deep perspective, there's no othering, but we've made it real, right? Similar to race. It is real. There's no need to think that it's just fictitious any longer, because it has real consequences, real opportunities, right? Advantages, as someone else is mentioning. But the power piece is critically important. So one thing that happens with othering and belonging is, let's go back to high school, right? Go back to high school. We've heard of Mean Girl cliques and In Crowd and the Jock Club and the Brainiacs and the Nerds, all of those, you know, groups of people. Sometimes we as kids did not want to be mean and harmful or exclude groups of people because our families didn't teach us that. That's not how we were raised. And we may have even saw or observed some attributes in Jane or John Doe that we really liked. But because of our affinity group, because of the group that we were attached to, whether it was the quote unquote in or the out group, we restricted ourselves from building wholesome, authentic relationships with Jane or John Doe because we didn't want to be seen with the other, right? With everybody else thought it was the other. Now, I make this a reference to power because what we have done through othering and belonging is, unfortunately, we collectively have ascribed power to whiteness. We give it power. We define appropriate. We define hairstyles. We define what skin is better. We define products based on it. We see, up until just most recent past 10 years, we see more white people on TV, right? We collectively ascribe power to whiteness. And so what that does is it takes away the inner power. And the more we can begin to do exactly what Mary is suggesting we do, right, without shame of who we are, to be able to ascribe power to community, with community, to be able to say that a single mom at 17 years old, it's a risk factor there, but what do? Hold her child until her brain develops? Like, it is up to us to begin to understand how and who we give power to. And sometimes just naturally, we are structured in a way where we give all of our inner and collective power to one group of racialized people while disappearing, dishonoring, or diminishing group's potential and power. So that is what power is. Power is not only the ability to cause things to happen, to make choice, or to continue to churn this invisible system. Power is also relational. So in the conversation, so one of the next steps I would have you to think about is to notice your relationship to quote unquote formal power, right? That is critically important for us to be able to say, who might we need to talk to? Who should I have a conversation with? And if ever I need to really learn something, simply put, do I freaking have all the answers? And does somebody else who might be impacted by this system of formal power have a better idea because they have been impacted by those systems, groups, and people who I ascribe power to, right? So be careful. Like it requires us to do our first works over again. And I think this is an opportunity for us to be hopeful to do our first works over again. We must question everything. And that starts with questioning ourselves. So invest, right? Invest in the conversation. I have a 12-year-old son, 6th grade. He's not the best student in the world, right? But he's a really good kid. And because of virtual school, it's just like some things I gotta work, like, right? I'm not like all on his back all the time. So he will, he'll get away with what he can. And then he's piled up on Wednesday doing a whole lot of work that he missed Monday and Tuesday. Long story short, taught me something though. He taught me that the ing in learning is ever present and persistent. See, we in systems, we know so much that we don't even take time to measure what we're learning, right? We want a box to check. So go back to how we hate boxes based on race, income, right? Society or geographical area. We hate those boxes. But when it comes to our white dominant thinking, we always want a box to check. We always want to have the answer. We always want that one lever to pull to get us to an objective outcome. I want to say that the more we begin to understand that the ing in understanding, in learning, and creating opportunities for belonging are present and persistent, and they are valuable in people's lives, including yours in your institution. So the third opportunity for you to think about effective ways of creating belonging for yourself and others is to invest in shared space to learn together, right? And measure, right? So the things that we measure may not be the most important things Brené Brown teaches us, right? But one thing that we can do today with today's world and expanding our sphere of helpers is we can measure just about anything we want to measure. Sometimes the funding is not going to be attached to those 3-hour learning sessions that you have in your institution. But just because funding is attached to it doesn't mean that it's not important for communities, right? So again, power and economics and our attachment to power and economics churn the system of inequities. We have to break the cycles, good people. And I think we can do that by taking ample, intentional time to learn together and also measure the impact that learning is having on us. The more that we can measure the impact that learning is having on us, the more we can visibly see progress where progress is hard to find. And in the conversation of race and racism, we end up at despair all the time because the progress is so hard to see. We wait for the big old thing to happen. The George Floyd Act to take place. The lever of 64 was the Civil Rights Act. Families First Prevention, if we're talking about child welfare, and now all of this American Cares dollars, right? $250 million for some people. All of those things become important. But what about what we need to learn in order to be in right relation with people? Those things too take diligence, effort, and intention, right? So I just wanted to elevate that because I'm feeling very stimulated by what I am seeing in the chat. So let me go ahead and proceed just a little bit, and we're going to take about 15 minutes to get to a couple of other questions here. So belonging. We've talked a little bit about it. I'm just going to give you sort of the shortened version of it from, again, John Powell, Institution of Othering and Belonging. So belongingness, right? We believe that only viable solution to the problem of othering is one involving radical inclusion and belongingness. The most important good we can distribute to each other in society is, again, membership, right? Group membership. These shared experiences of messiness, even these shared experiences of unknowing, the culture shift of asking more questions, right? The right to belong is prior to all other distributive decisions since it's members who make the decision, right? How are we allowing or affording opportunity to individuals with intention to help co-create their own lives without us passing judgment based on what the world told us about these people, and we have not broken bread one time with them. Beyond structural safeguards, we need a vision, right? And I wish this wasn't a quote because need for me causes a reaction, right? So I don't want to tell anybody on this call what we need to do. These are all suggestions. You take the good and leave the rest, right? These are up to you because the work is really up to you. It's in work. Corey can guide, but trust, I have to do my work continuously every single day to even suit up in a space to have these conversations. So the work is ongoing. So what I suggest is a vision of society that is inclusive with new identities and narratives that inoculate society from demagoguery and dehumanization, demonization of the other, right? While improving the well-being of everyone. Two things in this quote that I want to share a sharpened analysis with is the word inclusive and the term well-being. So two things. When it comes to utilizing terms such as inclusive, I want us to be clear that most institutions, even if there's a Black or non-white leader, most institutions are founded in whiteness. So we're asking individuals to speckle a little bit of who they are into an already inclusive, curated, white, predominantly white dominant thinking space. So let's be clear, if we go back to 1776 again, and we think about inclusion after we developed an identity of what American is, do you think that Native Americans want to include themselves in whiteness or to co-create something that is multicultural, right? So we want to move from just inclusive, because that's just a noun, right? That's bringing my favorite cultural dish on a Thursday or having conversations about bias, right? But it really doesn't get us to the structures, and we want to get to the structures and this concept of well-being. Well-being is for many non-white people, and I'm going to say specifically some, because I can't speak for all. Some Black individuals believe that being well, right? See, being well in my community is different. Being well in my home right now is much different than how you describe how I should live in well-being. We have well-being indicators across the country. We utilize data to ensure that families are reaching these well-being markers. But those well-being markers does not account for the environmental context or conditions that have been created to position me in a place where my definition of being well is that I got food in the refrigerator. I know how to rob Peter to pay Paul to get my rent paid. I got a payday loan out there. So what? I got a nice car, and it's above my pay grade. See, my well-being is not contingent upon how the system defines well-being, because that system is also one that has oppressed communities of color, especially, and positioned them in a place to be able to say, must be fun down there. And there you are with those rims on your car, and you got an iPhone, and you got nails done, but all this access to all of these other supports and services I haven't seen you take advantage of. Well, none of those supports and services are actually culturally efficacy. There's no cultural efficacy in those services for me. And who says that a family, a mom or dad, should not, based on our system of standards, right, should not be dignified and have good things? See, our definition of well-being needs, and this was intentional, needs to be tweaked a little bit to match cultural cultural perspectives of what being well means. Just wanted to go on a tangent there because I think it's critically important because we utilize that term in so many different ways. Now, cultivating a new identity is really where I want to take us in just the last couple of moments. So we started off with the self-acknowledgement, or at least I acknowledge that othering has a thread of fear attached to it. Anyone that is not like me, I am afraid of. And sometimes I might be afraid of understanding that I am more like them than I care to believe, because if I express my similarities to them, am I going to lose the benefits and the pros of being attached to the in group, right? This is deeply spiritual work with people. It requires a deep dive. And, you know, the cultivating a justice mindset or an anti-racist mindset requires us, particularly the dominant group in this conversation. I'm being race explicit. I'm talking white people, right? White people, to recognize that this conversation is not a racist hunt. This is not a conversation where we're trying to sleuth out who the most discriminatory person is in the room. Trust me, 402 years of oral history, we know who the person in the room is that we should stay away from. We know when there's a sense of belonging or not in a space. Sometimes we just have to put that smile on, as Maya Angelou says. We wear the smile well. When she says it's not a smile at all, she is just parting her lips, and that is it. Sometimes we have to understand that guilt and blame does not move anything forward. We as individuals, we love to stay there though, right? It gives us a subject to talk about, right? She made me do it. She made me feel that way. He did that. They did that, right? Now, guilt and blame, that's your stuff. You need to deal with it and get over it. And the outrage needs to turn into enrage, right? Many of us feel attacked in this work because the content is so real. Right? I can't say the content will diminish you. I believe that this conversation of race and racism is one that must be had, because we haven't had the conversation for so many years. And it is my belief that this conversation is one that will develop us. Remember, through the othering, specifically through the othering based on racial or physical characteristics, we follow an antiquated script of how not to have the conversation. And we put these things on, such as safety, right? In these spaces, I don't want to step in it. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to appear racist. I don't want to, there's all this fear and this blame and all of these ambiguities happening. What anchors all of that is denial. Many people will tell you that if you had right relation with me, if you had a right relationship with me, you can step in it all day long, but I have a right relationship with you to hold you accountable to what you stepped in. We never know if it stinks until we step in it. Sometimes we just gotta try. And another part of the antiquated script is that white people taught us that this conversation would be hard. We have all of us, from every racial category, we've been having conversations about race in our home since we were children. We just heard a story from Missouri. We know that these conversations are only in isolation. We need to make these conversations more public, and that need is, again, intentional. So we move from being naive, resistant, silent, because there's this script that Peggy McIntosh and the woman who wrote White Fragility, those are like the white scholars of the century, right? But there are so many other white anti-racists outside of John Brown that I'm going to encourage white people to begin to look at their own history of people who stood for disrupting and dismantling white supremacist systems, right? Frederick Douglass did not make it to who he is today by himself as an escaped slave, right? He did not do that alone, and he did it with more than just John Brown. So the silence, right? The script that we've been told is that white people need to be quiet in this conversation. No, white people shouldn't be quiet. White people need to recognize how their power shifts and shapes a room and lean in with authenticity, not with whiteness, right? Not with the stuff that comes with false superiority. We don't want you to be quiet. Quiet does not move things. Quiet does not create shared learning spaces. Quiet often is, sometimes, silent is also listening, but we listen through conversation as well, right? So it's more, right? I'm here to tell you from Black Body, it's not mum's the word, it's more about recognizing and being aware of the power that comes into spaces when your position's present, or your socioeconomics present, or your ambivalence is present. Stereotyping, regret, defensiveness, emotional avoidance, because going back to that safety, we in this space are learning more and more. And I think what has happened so wonderfully for me as an individual in this space, I've been doing this for several years now, more than I care to count, not only living it, but trying to teach, model, and guide. I know that the world really wants me to be palatable. I think one of the beauties of this past year is I no longer have to be palatable. I only have to be myself. If you cannot digest me, that is not my issue any longer, right? That is not, my allegiance is not with an individual. My allegiance is not with an institution. My allegiance is with social impact, because that is where I feel belonging. That is where I own my belonging, and in the impact and the shared experiences that we have as we continue to try to disrupt, dismantle this particular system of oppression that continues to churn out inequities across all racial lines based on an advantage. So the emotional avoidance comes from a place that even in the space that we're creating, we always hear one of the norms is to be, safe, right? We want a safe environment. Well, non-white people, especially Black people, haven't felt safe for centuries, but they still show up. They don't even feel safe in places of the workplace, right? So we have to understand that when we say safe in the conversation of race and racism, we're really talking about protecting white emotional safety. We need to create a space of belonging where mad, wicked energy comes into that environment and everybody gets to dump, cry, talk, share, cut one another off, break bread together, because that's what people in belonging really do. They love, they fight, they cry, and they come back together again to do it. No quasi communities, authentic communities is where belonging really thrives. And we can only be authentic if we are brave, aware, affirming, solid with one another, and are living, learning up to being an anti-racist thinker. And that takes us to just being color bold. Remember, there's nothing wrong with anybody's color. It's been what has been attached to that color. That needs to shift and change. So I see a question here that says, what does safe mean? Again, I'm learning more and more that safe really means emotional safety for one group and not the other. Brave spaces is where, simply put, all of us on this call knew that we were going to be physically safe. I doubt that we are ever going to call people out of their name, attack them, say bad things, because that's not who we are as human beings. So we have to acknowledge, one, who we are as people, accept that who we are as people are learners, and that some things that I say may be unintentional, but it is not anything that should be taken personally. We are a lot of human beings that want our self to be protected while we maintain an environment that does not feel protective for all, right? So safety in the conversation of race has always alluded to the fact that we as Black people want to be palatable for white people. That does not create belonging. That does not create authenticity. It continues to have people shift, merge, assimilate, and be inauthentic with one another. So I would suggest us to think about acknowledging one primary fact: everybody in the space is safe, right? Everybody is safe physically, emotionally, if we bring our emotions to the table, that means you're unleashing and everybody else is too. Not on a person, we're talking about building solidarity to a cause. And that's where we should move, because the more we stay on the interpersonal level, again, who done it, why they say it, all of these things, we won't get to the systems part. And that's the distraction that we haven't really sort of paid attention to. This sleight of hand tells us that the more we attack one another, the system is going to continue to churn out inequities. It's time for us to be brave, right? So to me, brave spaces is where we should make a pivot. And I'll just end by saying, I'm going to stop sharing because I want to see some faces here. So I of course, with 8 minutes to go, I start to feel like real good about the conversation, right? Like that's always what happens. Bottom line, people, we are complex human beings, and we will continue to complicate the you-know-what out of just being humane with one another, right? Some of us need to have data that says othering is real. Others say, just hear my experiences, right? I don't need it to be quantifiable, right? We do that with sexism all the time, right? And we force women to hold on to things that have happened to them for years and years because the environment says, you shouldn't have let that happen, or there's fear of no one's going to believe, right? What's the environment that we've created, or that person is always going to be the one that's talking about race, right? So yeah, I have been that person, and what I say in response is what my friend and colleague Ken Hardy says is, I'll stop talking about it when you do. Let me sit back and listen to you sometime, right? And I think that is what reciprocity calls for, that we all have a shared experience. And believe it or not, all people suffer, white people are poor, right? We know that saying privilege is tough. It's not about tangibles. Just look at the outcomes. There's not one state in this union that has a census tract where white families live 20 to 40% below the Fed poverty level. Not one state. 27 for Black, 16 for Indigenous, about 12 or so, 7 or so for Hispanic, and 0, right? 0 for white people. Now, socioeconomics aside, I say these things because we're all impacted by the system of oppression, right? And when we can connect, right? Like connect to that fact and begin to build coalesce around principles, values, and allow ourselves to be vulnerable lovers and critically examine one another, I believe we are living in a more just and accepting society, right? And these things don't require a lot of money even, right? It just requires some time and some humility. And as the more we do that, we actually build fitness and fortitude. So this particular conversation is like one of those transferable skills that you can take to any sector, right? In any playground, in any school, in any supermarket, right? This is the root here of the bulk, if not all, of our challenges and systems. We just have a hard time with confronting that. And I'll just wrap with this, like, not to be a downer here, but to show you like how big this is. we all know that in the whole trial, race was not mentioned one time. Not once. And I don't know if there's any attorneys on the call, but if you are, you went to law school, and Supreme Court says we cannot talk about structural racism. It has to be overt. It has to be like really, really overt. So, right. So I just want to end with love and gratitude for not only the invite, but the vibe that I received from the chat and some of the other responses here, and now seeing a few of your eyes gives me a better sense of the energy that was behind the scenes. So again, just appreciate being on this journey with you, because what happens in your communities is like that pebble in the pond, right? I'm in Florida, but who knows what trajectory my son's going to be, right? May go to school in California. At least I'm pushing them to go to school away, right? So he may go to school, right, in your community, or do the work that we do. So what impacts you and yours and your community will also impact my child, right? And that goes positively or negatively. So let it be the positive, and let's create this environment where everybody fits, right? Not having to force themselves to fit in. Right? So I'll stop there and see if there's any poets in the house who wants to take us out.
Well, Corey, with 2 minutes left, I'm going to have to wrap us up. But I want to thank you so much for your wisdom today. I knew that you were going to provoke us. You never disappoint in that way. You always cause us to think. There's so many takeaways that I will walk away with. And I have to admit to you, I find this to be very emotional. When George Floyd died, we had an internal meeting at CDSS, and many people were present, sharing their thoughts about what had happened. And people were crying and saying, we thought we were so much further along than this. And I just really appreciate you calling it a journey. I think that, we've been slapped in the face of really having to address racism in a way that hasn't been addressed for quite some time. And I don't think that many of us really understood as much as we are understanding. And it is a journey, and it is a process. And I feel like it's a process for all of us. This is something that we are all walking through collectively, and it's emotional. It's emotional because it is, it's sad, it's uncomfortable. It's, I could bring up so many emotions that are going on in all of us as we walk this out. And I expect we will continue to walk out. But I appreciate so much, Corey, for you just really, really opening it up for us to talk about today, and hopefully helping us to be prepared for further difficult conversations, and for us to interrupt the system, as you've stated, and really not be accepting of anything less than that authentic engagement and relational experience with each and every person that we work with and share life with. So I thank you for today, and I thank you all. My little small group that I was in was very transparent, very authentic, very real. I appreciate all of you that were in that small group and shared. I hope that all of you had a similar experience where you got in touch with things within yourself in today's presentation, and that we will continue to be provoked to interrupt racism, to understand it more fully and how it's showing up, and to work to figure out how to mitigate it and stop it. So with that, I ask you to please join us for our final CAP Month presentation. It will be on Wednesday, April 28th. Once again, we will have an 11 to 1 time frame. It's going to be myself, Katie Albright from Safe and Sound, Ron Brown from Children's Bureau, and Sheila Boxley from the CAP Center. And we're going to be talking about prevention in California and doing some reflection on what's occurred in the presentations prior. And so we look forward to some discussion, some opportunity for you to inform us as you've done today. And I just thank you all for participating. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.